Doug, how are you?
Ryan, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. I'm very excited to jump into this topic. You are pioneering a different way of thinking about economics and value and demand and all these things that I think a lot of people have um, been resting on a certain set of standards over the years. And I'm very fascinated because I think the topic and how I think you can unpack this concept of how we are trying to figure, because it's all about making decisions about what, where are
Yes.
people
Mhm.
going, and that's what everybody's tuning into. Like, how do we make good decisions to get our company and to get our lives where we want it to go? But I have some work to do to better understand it too, even though I'm very fascinated with all this stuff.
Right.
So, why don't you just give everybody just a little bit of a background of you, your background, and then like the concept, and we can kind of unpack the concept in a way I think people
Okay.
have a pretty good, solid way of understanding it.
Yeah. So the concept is called hypernomics, and hyper means existing in more than three dimensions, and nomics comes from the root nonomy, meaning a field of study. So hypernomics is a field of study that deals in this case, economic phenomena that happen in four or more dimensions. And so while it sounds complicated, and frankly, even having discovered it, I didn't understand when I first saw it. So I got to confess that to your audience. It was a mystery to me for a
And
couple
I
of
can't wait
months. How
to
could
I
this
can't wait for you to
possibly be?
tell them the story about how you figured that out too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll tell them that. So I I've been trying to prove the law of supply and demand since I got out of school, decades ago, and never could do it. And
Why were you so infatuated with it?
well, I had a degree in economics, and the law of supply and demand didn't seem to work for anything outside of a commodity like iron ore or gold or oil. And so I kept playing around with it, playing around with it. So I had this kind of background
Mm-hmm.
problem floating in my head for decades. And then one day, some seemingly mundane event happened. The mundane event was that my wife and I went off to our local Best Buy after we'd traipsed a bunch of other stores and looking for a washing machine of all things. So my wife said, I like this machine right here. She says, it's got more capacity than we have at home. And I thought, capacity versus price. Well, it's a two-dimensional problem right there. I can handle that. And then she said, I only got one delicate cycle at home. And I really need to have two or three. And I like this machine. It's got multiple delicate cycles. And I thought, cycles versus price. She got cycles and she's got capacity. She's working a 3D problem. So I really liked the machine we were looking at. And there was another one, same brand, next model up, more capacity, more cycles, also more dollars. And I said to her, well, what about this one? She says, it's too expensive. We can't afford it. And in that instant, I realized that any purchase we were making was going to add to the total quantity that was going to be purchased of that model. And that was going to be a quantity versus price element.
Mm-hmm.
So she was looking at capacity, cycles, price, and we were part of the quantity thing. That was part of a four-dimensional problem that she was working on in her head. And so I raced home and had a vision of a four-dimensional system, which basically looks like a big T. If you have one wall that intersects another wall where the wall tees in, if you can see on either side of that wall, that's what this four-dimensional system looks like.
I want to unpack that more. Keep going. I want to unpack that more because I think you're.
Yeah. So it turns out that the way people value things can be expressed in a three-dimensional system, and you can work it out, more features if you need it. So, for example, with electric cars, if you add range, people understand if you go from a car that's
Mm-hmm.
got 100 miles range, you go with the one that's got 300, well, you're going to be paying more for the 300-mile range. And similarly, if you got a car that's got 200 horsepower and you're going up to one that's got 500 horsepower, you're going to pay more for that. And so what everybody understands intuitively is that you're paying more for range and you're paying more for horsepower. And so range, horsepower, and price, that's this three-dimensional system that you already know.
Mm-hmm.
You already know this in your head. And then you also know that, Tesla makes these things called Model S's that were one of the first real popular cars out there. And you can get them with up to 1,000 horsepower in them. But as you start to go to 1,000 horsepower, the number sold starts to fall compared to, say, something like the lesser powered Tesla S, and then the Tesla 3 and the Tesla Y, and all the way down to something like the Nissan Leaf. And so you already know that as the price falls, people will buy more. Conversely, if the price rises, people buy
Mm-hmm.
fewer. And so you already know all the stuff intuitively. And so the breakthrough, such as it was to figure out that these things all meet up at the same axis, the same price
Like the
axis.
intersection of that T, like of the wall, like you said. So
Yes,
like you have
it's
two
an
walls.
intersection of the T and the wall. That's exactly where everything meets up. So on the right-hand side, if you were facing it, you've only got this plane, which is demand. And so you would have little points on this plane that would, quantity would be the horizontal axis and price would be the vertical axis. And so you'd see points that would be further to the right as the quantity increases for the low price things that are low and far to the right. And then as the price increases, you'd have fewer and fewer. You'd be moving to the left towards the T intersection.
Mm.
And then if you're on the other side of the T intersection, if
And
you're
if
right
you
down,
want to hold one of those up for the people that are watching
yeah.
on
In
YouTube
fact, this
too,
is the model.
you're doing a good job, and I think we can unpack this because I wanted to make sure people understand. Because I think people understand this stuff, Doug, in their head because they've been buying stuff like this forever, and I think people know that.
That's the important point, Ryan. You've actually hit the nail on the proverbial head there. So in this red, what we usually call it right-hand plane, the reason we coded it red is that demand, it has a limit to it. And so this white line through these white dots, for people that are seeing here, we have a white line that depicts the demand for the, in this case,
traditional X, Y axis of demand,
Yeah. So in this case,
price.
The horizontal axis going to the right is quantity, and the vertical axis going up is price. And so as the price decreases, people buy more. So this dot down here at the bottom, that's the Nissan Leaf, and these guys up at the top, these are the first Tesla S's. And so that's their demand over here on this side.
Yep.
Then on this side, on the green side, we have what's known as their value. So the two Teslas had more horsepower than anybody else over here, and they had more range than anybody else over here. And so this forms this
diagonal plane almost, right?
A diagonal plane, yeah, that actually intersects all these points. And so points that are above this plane, again, these points represent the range, horsepower, and then price. So it's a 3D point in space. And if that sounds complicated, every one of you has got a 3D point in space right now that says where you are relative to latitude, longitude, and altitude. So
honestly, the way I was thinking about Doug, like sorry to interrupt, but let me know if I'm thinking about this right. Because like I'm in my office right now that's got four walls, and there's this three-dimensional space. It's the space inside the walls. And if I look over in my bottom right-hand corner, that's one, like you have the walls are different variables, right?
Yes.
And then you would be placing these dots inside the room, like almost like hanging planets.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And then you're going more from like one bottom right-hand corner to the top left-hand corner.
Yes, exactly.
Different variables. And the intersection is where all those variables come together.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, one of the things I've used as a mnemonic to help me out when I first came up with this, and some people found this useful in some of my conferences, is I look for a famous two-room house. And for those of your listeners that are into rock and roll, they probably think a famous two-room house. I know what he's going to go to. Well, yes, going to Tupelo, Mississippi for the house of Elvis, where he was born. So Elvis was born in a little, what they call a shotgun shack, which is a two-room house. It's rectangular, and it's kind of split down the middle into basically two cubes. And if you can imagine a rectangular house split into two cubes, and one cube contains the value parameters, and another cube contains the demand parameters, now you've got the basic idea of how this 4D system works. And then every point on the demand side has a paired point on the value side all the time. So they're always paired. So for example,
is that also like is when we cast a shadow onto the ground, right? So we're three-dimensional, and then the sun is casting the shadow. So you've got
that's
the demand,
excellent. I like that.
Demand that is two-dimensional,
right?
Which is the demand. So you're two-dimensional, which is your shadow, and then the value is the three-dimensional person. That's
great. I'm going to have to cite you in a conference or two. I'm going to have to use that.
This is just me trying to understand this shit, man. I think, the whole point.
I'm still trying to explain it to myself. So I really am. I mean, it's there's a lot of ways to explain this, and I've got some words that explain this, but it's It's the kind of thing that you want to keep refining the explanation so that you get to the point where more and more people can grasp it.
Well,
And
and I think
obviously you're
like, why
grasping it
does
right
this?
now.
Well, because like in I don't know if I'm just too dense where it's like I just want to make good decisions, right? So I'm trying to figure
Right.
out how to make good decisions. I think a lot of people tuning in are the same way. So when I look at for the people like thinking about this, you got the two-dimensional, but then there's the three-dimensional where you can see spatially, like, I
Hmm.
want to make more of that. That's in that
Right.
area, right? And then you're just choosing because like when you think about it, like the business owners listening in are going, okay, well, what features and benefits do I have in my product or service?
Right.
And you know what I mean? And like, there's the whole, what's the whole, Doug, I can't remember, but it's like low cost. I don't know. There's the three things you can't have all three. I can't remember what it was. Jim Collins talks about it, but
Right.
it's
Right.
like low cost, high value, and it's value cost. I don't know. This is probably tied into what you're saying, but anyways, like
Hmm.
people are making decisions of where to deploy their time, capital, energy. Those are the three things that we have limitations of, and so they're trying to figure out where to invest in their business through acquiring companies or building out
Oh,
products or
right.
services companies. And if you're just looking at the two-dimensional, you're just missing an entire dimension. No pun intended.
Yes. We're entire two dimensions. In fact, so the other thing
Yeah,
that's great
yeah.
about this, right, is it forms a series of maps. And so on this demand side here, this line, this white line shows you what we call the demand frontier. And
Okay.
there's different
Yep.
kinds that form. And so this is what's known as an upper demand frontier, which means that the market was price limited to how much it could buy. Now, if you were to plot the stocks, the S&P 500 every day,
Mm-hmm.
you would find that they have an upper boundary. And you'd also find that they have an outer boundary, and you'd find that they have a lower boundary and an inner boundary. And the
Which would
importance of
those
this.
boundaries? Would those boundaries be the room that we're talking about?
Yes,
Essentially.
exactly right. Yeah. Well, they'd be the marks on the wall in the room where their
Okay.
limits are.
Got it. Yep.
And so the limits need to be drawn and understood and see how they move over time. So, for example, if you look at this red side again, you see there's nobody playing in this particular point in time between 60 and 80K. And
Yeah,
of
but so
course,
what I'm at, for the listeners, what I'm looking at is you've got the top of the quantity, or you have high price, so that'd be like the Teslas,
right.
right? The high, and then there you go at the bottom. What you said, what is the Leafs or the lower
Yeah, the
price?
Nissan Leaf. So back in
Yep.
2013, when this model was built, you had a couple of real high-end Teslas, and then you had Nissan Leaf and a bunch of other cars that were
Mm-hmm.
$30,000 to $60,000, but there was nothing between $60,000 and eighty thousand
Got it. Yep.
dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could imagine, like, if you go into your local Best Buy and this takes some zeros away, imagine there's a whole bunch of $300 TVs
Mm-hmm.
and there's a whole bunch of $600 TVs, but your budget might be $500. And you'd say, well, where are the $500 TVs? And then the proprietor might say to you, well, we don't have any $500 TVs, just like
Mm-hmm.
this, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you were in the business of making TVs, you'd say to yourself, well, I bet you there's a market for $500 TVs because there's a market for the stuff on the top and stuff on the bottom. And so by interpolation, you can find out that there's a price, what we call a price gap over here on the
Yeah.
demand side.
Yeah.
Nobody's
Yep.
playing in that zone. Now, if you go over here onto the value side, you see
Yep.
that big plane here.
Yep.
You see how there's a lot of people with low horsepower and low range
Mm-hmm.
back in the day, and there's just a couple of points, basically the Tesla points, that are out
Mm-hmm.
there that have range and horsepower. But you see how there's nobody playing in between?
Yep.
Well,
Yep.
Tesla solved that too. They put a bunch of models in there.
Yep.
They came up with the Y and the 3, and they put various combinations of horsepower into this gap. And they basically did intuitively, which somebody like me had to do math, by geometry, try to figure out, well, where should I place my next product?
Well, and
And
that's what I think is very fascinating, Doug, is like I
yeah,
have just this absolute faith in the scrappy entrepreneurs that have started their companies where they're
hmm,
intuitively figuring this out by listening to their customers and having conversations and coming
right,
back and saying, well, we didn't sell any of this. We tried this marketing campaign. I think there's a lot of sound intuition. And then you go back to like the two or three dimension, people are like, well, I know they're missing some variables in that.
yeah, yeah, and so well, the caution will be within intuition. Like for example, I mean, I think Elon Musk has got intuition in droves, but very famously, as far as we're concerned, there's a like demand frontier that's formed for business jets. And that frontier is actually moving outward. So there's more and more jets being sold, year over year. And so in 2014, I plotted where the last 10 years the frontier was at $120 million, and there were 47 vehicles that could have been sold at $120 million. And then 5 years later, it was growing. You could have sold maybe 63 units at that price. Now, while this stuff is going on in the broad market, a Texas billionaire named Robert Bass, one of the Bass brothers out of Fort Worth, well, he decides he's going to build himself a supersonic business jet. And so you're talking about what Collins was talking about, what you need to have correct. So in our vernacular, you need to have cost, value, and demand all figured out correctly. And so the Bass team came up with a cost estimate to develop this aircraft, and it had the right number of zeros. They guessed it was going to take them $4 billion. And that was about what we would have predicted. It was pretty close. So we said, hey, cost, you got a thumbs up here. And then we did some analysis about what the thing was worth. Well, it turns out at the real high end of the business market, people are paying a whole big premium to go from Mach 0.9 to Mach 0.91 to Mach 0.92. There's a big difference between going Mach 0.92 to 9.25. And so people have paid a big premium. Actually, that little 0.05, that's 3 miles per hour faster. But these guys want to have bragging rights. And so they're actually willing to pay more for that. But crucially, only so many people can pay for that. And so if you go out and you poll your customers and you say, we're going to build this business jet, and you ask people how many, if we build it, will you come? And so people did that back in the days of the Concorde. They say, if we build this, will you buy it? So for those of you who may not remember, the Concorde was a supersonic business airliner that the French consortium, along with the Brits, decided to build back in the 60s, and it went Mach 2 across the Atlantic. And the preliminary calculations for the number of sales were between 250 and 350. Well, they sold 20.
Oh, no.
Right. They sold 20. Now, some people say, well, the thing made money. Well, it made money for the operators after the operators had it, but the people that invested in building it, they lost their, they lost about just about everything because they didn't recoup their prices. So enter Robert Bass into the supersonic business aircraft market. So he comes in, he says, well, we're going to make this plane, we're going to sell it for $120 million. Well, our analysis said it was worth 160. So you got that right. So it's even priced below that. So 120 is sustainable. So we're going to spend $4 billion to make it. That's sustainable too. And then he said, crucially, well, we're going to sell 300 of these guys in a decade and 500 overall. Now, recall, I told you what I said was when you're starting out, the limit was 47. Mm-hmm. 5 years later, it was 63. So now what happens in commercial aircraft markets, like those for the Boeing products and the Airbus products, like the 737s and all those things, when they launch a new model, like there's a 777 big -9 now, they usually launch it with several hundred orders. And so Boeing or Airbus, depending on who's got the new product, they're basically guaranteed hitting the break-even point if they can make the plane fly.
Right.
So Bass takes off, instead of having several hundred orders, recall that he wanted to have 300 to 500, he takes off with 20 orders in 2014. And so time marches on, and I'm tracking this the whole while, and it comes 2019, still got just the 20 orders. So I write a piece on LinkedIn, in December 2020, said, worth every penny, not enough pennies. And in this little LinkedIn post, I said, hey, the analytics say that this plane's worth the 120 or maybe more than that. Their cost is fine, but there aren't enough dollars in the world for you to make your sales target. And so I get this angry reply from a guy a few days after this. Turned out after I said that, they claimed they had an order. What it was in the aerospace world is what they call an option order. Basically, it said that if you build it and it can fly, we'll exercise our option and buy it, but it's not a firm order to buy. So they came in with a bunch of option orders. Said, well, we came in with this big option order, and we're going to make it. And so they went from 20 potential orders to, I think it was, maybe if you put all the dollars into this, it might have been 93, but there was some training involved and some offsets. So 93 was kind of pushing it. But recall, again, they wanted to have 300. So I said, well, that's great. I'm happy you did that. You're still not going to make your number. So fast forward 6 months, the whole company went bankrupt.
Oh.
And they
Oh,
blamed COVID on it. And interestingly, what happened during COVID, for those of you that follow business aviation, well, business aviation rose because people didn't want to fly. The people that could afford to didn't want to fly commercial anymore because it was hard to fly commercial.
Yeah.
So they went into business aviation.
Tough pill to swallow when it actually increased your demand.
Yeah.
Right.
Precisely. So the thing was that they hadn't paid attention to that frontier. Now, the same kind of thing can happen when it gets to the value analysis. You can value something too highly or value something too low. So in aerospace, again, and I'll switch over to automotive here in a second, but in aerospace in the early 2000s, there was this guy from this company called Microsoft. He was the number 7 employee at Microsoft, a guy named Vern Rayburn. Vern Rayburn came down to Albuquerque, New Mexico. He said, I'm going to build a small business jet and I'm going to make them like computers. Just say, I'm going to just stamp them out. So he came up with this design, which he had to do twice because he didn't power it up enough the first time. And even though his engineers told him that he was too close to the edge, he built a jet that didn't take off in the required field thing. So he had to basically redo the whole thing. He says, I'm going to make this 5-place or 6-place jet. It's going to go 410 miles an hour. It's going to have a range of 1,300 miles. And I'm going to charge people $775,000 for this. Now, you got to go out and study to see, well, what do you think the thing ought to be worth based on what the other features, what the other jets are fetching? When you do that, which I did, when you do that, it turns out the thing was worth closer to $2.5 million. Basically, there was about a 5% chance that his price was right, or it could have been lower. Basically, a 95% chance that he had missed it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, imagine if you had imagine that the real price, I guess, well, let's just call it $2 million, I think, $2 million. Imagine if you took your $2 million house, if you had one, and you put it on the market for $775,000. Well, you'd have all these orders coming.
I was going to say, you just like, to use the analogy, you're have guaranteed a nosedive right into the ground.
Right. And what you wouldn't do is probably sell it at that price. But, imagine all these orders came in,
Yep.
So in aerospace, I mean, there's no just one of these things. There's as many as you care to produce. So he gets all these orders and he gets 2,600 orders. Now, to put that in context, the biggest selling business jet over the course of a decade only sells about 500 to 600. And he gets 5 times this, right? Well, he starts to make it and build a jet, and it costs him more than he can sell it. Then he's selling it for, not what he could sell it for, what he was selling it for. And they gradually try to raise the price, but by that time he'd already sunk himself.
So is Elon Musk doing this kind of analysis? You think he's doing it intuitively because of how he's launching these products in such a unique fashion, like you're talking about?
I think he's just got uncommon tuition. I mean, he kind of silently, well, for him, he kind of silently set up this thing called Starlink several years ago, where he's shooting up 80 or 90 satellites at a time. And now if you look at the Starlink map, he's covering the world with these things. He's got guys that are going, with the Earth's orbit. He's got other ones that are going in polar orbits. I had a friend of mine that's got a fly-in fishing lodge in Manitoba. He's right on the edge of where all of Musk's
I bet you that's trippy watching
coalesce, and he can get internet now in an area in the world that didn't have internet before. So Musk just has this knack for figuring out what the open space in the market is.
Well, I just think about like the cyber trucks or like all these different products that he's launching that because why I think all of this topic is so fascinating, Doug, is because one of my passions is just understanding why people make certain decisions and why they work or don't work. And I just watch over the years, I think a lot of the dumb money exacerbated, the dumb money, multiplied by vanity metrics just kind of got everything disoriented. And it's at some point, the name of the game is cash flow and equity growth. That's the entire point, is that we all care about cash flow and equity growth, but there's been this noise that's masked the underlying fundamentals of what you're talking about. You can't ignore the examples that you talk about selling a jet for $775 when it costs $2 million.
Yeah,
it just doesn't work, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Now I told you I had promised you an automotive example. So for your younger viewers in the audience and listeners, there's this film called Back to the Future. Maybe you heard of it,
Oh, I
in
love it.
which I love Back to the Future, in which the lead character has a friend, an older friend named Doc Brown, and Doc Brown decides to take a car called a DeLorean and turn it into a time machine. And when Marty confronts Doc about, said, "You built a time machine out of a DeLorean?" Yes, all astonished. And to which Doc Brown says, "Well, the way I figure it, you're going to build a time machine. Why don't you do it with some style?" Well, that's actually a telling story right there, because John DeLorean banked on the fact that this thing had a lot of style. So for those of you who don't recall what this was, it was a stainless steel sport car that had gull wings. So its primary features were these gull wings for the doors and stainless steel. And he priced this at about $25,000 roughly, in an age in which the $25,000 cars had 100 more horsepower than he was offering. He was offering about 138, about the equivalent of a 2006 Civic, which I have out in the garage here. I got one of those guys. You take a 2006 Civic and you match it up to a DeLorean, they got about the same horsepower, right? So he expected that, people to buy the DeLorean based on the style, and some people did. But he messed up the value of this thing. So instead of being worth $25,000, it was worth more like $15,000. And so instead of hitting the target at $25,000 for demand, he was past that frontier, just like Arion was. And so he didn't sell the required number of units, and it was overpriced. I mean, a few people could afford it, and they did, and he went bankrupt. So this is real world analytics. So I basically reconstructed what the car market looked like as he was entering it to be able to figure out those parameters. And it turns out that he exceeded the demand parameter. He exceeded the value parameter. In fact, he messed up on cost too. So he messed up basically any way you could make an error economically, he did. And that sunk him.
Pardon the brief interruption. I really hope you're enjoying the conversation with Doug. It's probably a little bit of mind bending. It's a different type of topic and a different type of thinking that most of us are used to. But I think he's really onto something, because I think we all understand that our customers buy for a lot of different reasons. And at the end of the day, in order to scale our company and make enough cash flow for us, we need to be able to anticipate why they're buying and then how to scale our company. And we can't always predict the future. And I think a lot of the stuff that Doug's talking about is fascinating, but it's very difficult for us to access how to actually implement some of the things he's talking about. But I do know that if we have a roadmap from where we're at right now, our point A to point B with our financials, we have a lens to make decisions, so we can start to place bets that are calculated to say we have an X amount of excess cash that we can place a bet into a market or service or product or person that can hopefully get us to where we want to go faster, if we have that financial lens and a dashboard in order to see that visibility to enhance our decision making. So there's two things that you can do if you're interested in having that kind of visibility. One is use the link in the show notes below to have a discovery call with me to talk about our coaching that is backed by the Academy to level up your education if you want to learn more about how that kind of visibility works and how valuations and how the financial strategies work to make better bets. Or two, you can schedule a discovery call with myself to tee yourself up to have a complimentary financial assessment with my team at Arcona, where we're going to plug in our dashboard, analyze your numbers, and come back on a call to walk you through how your numbers look in a different way. Kind of like, let's start with three-dimensional, which I can see into the future three-dimensionally with my financials, because all three statements are organized together and connected to your target valuation. And I think that helps change your mindset and help you view and run the company as a financial asset. So if you're interested in scheduling a call, use the show notes and the link below. Thanks everybody. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the interview with Doug. Doug, with I think about like the business owners that we work with, because there's kind of two big buckets that I think about in business. It's the people that are going for the moonshots, that are going public, that are, I mean, the definition of unicorns, it's rare. And I think we're going to see a lot more of, hey, that is actually rare, that someone figures this out, like what Elon does, and it takes a shitload of time and money to get there over time. But like I think that people are thinking like this as owners and consumers naturally, but like then we're using kind of antiquated resources or tools to make the decisions on this. And I think about like product or like think about services. Like I think about like one of the big challenges with professional services companies or even
Hmm.
manufacturers, like what features and benefits do we put into our product offering?
Right,
And like
right,
they
right.
should be able to map out like what is it that people are caring about and is this gonna work or not versus like the sheer trial and error. Because I think about like the Pareto principle, how many privately held companies get over 5 million in revenue? Like 94% of all privately held companies, it's 5.6 million are below
Right.
5 million in revenue. And I think that like there's a lot of factors that go into that. They tap
Hmm.
out from the cash flow, the ability to reinvest, but they don't know how to place their bets to
Right.
get the company over, which is the cash flow is the oxygen to get over that perspective or that over that hump.
Sure.
And it's about how to figure out the product pricing fit and what features and benefits to include with the constraints you have. I mean, that's the biggest challenge people have.
Yeah, I have a book on my shelf. I think it was written by it's by Christensen, entitled, back to
Craig
your point, The
Christensen?
Innovator's
Yeah.
Dilemma.
Yeah, yep,
And
yep.
the what I would argue is there's no dilemma at all. The market will tell you what it want. This is our key phrase. The market will tell you what it wants, doesn't have, and can afford. There are spaces in the market that are bounded by other products. So if you interpolate in between that, there are products that there's a space in the market for a new product that is not identical to another product that's got a certain number of features that are guaranteed to fit based on somebody buying more of a given feature and less of it for this feature and more and less of it in this other feature. In fact, you can take, it can be up to 6 or 7 features that you could identify. At a certain point, though, the statistics start to neck
Merge.
down. There's nothing else you can add, but you can take various cuts at it. So you can take a bunch of different cuts and show how the market should behave based on how it's behaved to date. And so the other thing we like to say is we like to take a look at when we're looking at markets, we like to look at the distant past, the near past, and the present to predict the near future. So again, the distant past, the near past, and the present to predict the near future. So the way I like to look at it is,
I love that. Predict
yeah, say
the near
you have
future.
kids, Ryan. Do you have a kid?
Yep, twin girls that are 7.
Oh, great. Oh, cool. Well, that's like soccer ball kid age, right?
Yeah, that's it. They're all chasing
Well,
the same ball. Yeah, yeah.
imagine if one of the girls is kicking a ball to the other girl, and so she kicks it, and a second out, you say that's the distant past, and so you know where it is a second out, and then say you go another 2 seconds, and you say, well, that's the near past because it's going to come to me pretty soon, and that 2.5 seconds is going past you, it's going right there. That's the present. And so you can say, based on the distant past 2 seconds ago
Mm-hmm.
and a second ago, and now, right now, I predict in a half a second, it's going to be over here.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically, this sphere that's moving from the distant past to the near past to
Mm-hmm.
the present to the future, there's actually an area in a market where the value is greater than the cost, and there's sufficient demand, and you've got enough enough room to make it. So that if you can imagine the top side of the ball, if you will, being the value of something, and the bottom side of the ball being the cost of something, there is an area in between in which you can make a profit. And so this thing is moving over time. Now these things shift.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In economics, they shift. Just like a ball, if you instantly hit it, would be squished,
Mm-hmm.
and then it might have a rebound effect. The market's going to have a certain shape to it, but it's going to take in the distant past to the near past to the present. You move forward. We call this area that's open here, that we call this the financial opportunity space. Sorry, I was a little long-winded, but he had to name it
No, no,
something.
no, no.
But
Yeah.
the movement over time is pretty simple. So we call that economic trajectory analysis, or ETA. So the space that was here, was there, then is here right now, and as you observe it going by, you should be over here in the not too distant
It's
future.
you know what I think about too, like and I think about going back to, I think, because I think in spatial, like
Oh,
that's where
good.
like,
That's going
and
to
I
help you
think
with
about
this.
like,
Yes.
well, that's why like I think about this room. If the room is like, and you have all these balls in the room
Hmm.
based on where it is in that, like the plot, like you're talking about, you're trying to
Right.
go to the space that's open, and then
Hmm.
like the market will fill up the room eventually, right? Like you want the whole room,
Yes.
right? The room will the room, as long as the market's healthy, it will fill the room with different companies that meet it. And going back to then your ball example, and this is, I don't know if
Right.
this is totally crazy, but like how I think, Doug, is like the cash flow is the oxygen that
Yes.
has to take the ball from the past, the distant past, to the recent past, to the present, to the future, to the near future. And the moment you run out of freaking cash flow, it's done. The game's over.
Right.
And so, like when I think about it, it's like you have to. That's a needle that has to be threaded, and
Yes.
like you can't. What I have been fascinated with is you can't ignore that. It's a law of nature. Like the income statement,
Right.
the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement is what it is, and you can't avoid that. And so you have to explain. You have to extrapolate what you just said, and then manage that cash flow. Or you're like, and what I've seen over the last 4 years or so is like the the abundance of private equity, venture capital, and free money has
Hmm.
ignored the fundamentals of that shit.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And
Hmm.
and it's just so like then therefore there's like then you can't extrapolate the reality until
Oh,
it
no, no,
sets in.
no. Mm-mm. Yeah, that's exactly true. Now, what's interesting here, the other point that maybe I didn't emphasize enough here, Ryan, is that the reason this stuff all works is that people self-aggregate their behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
That boundary that I showed you there, I didn't draw that boundary. In the case of electric cars, the several thousand people that were buying electric cars self-aggregated that boundary. And as more people came into the market, that boundary would change. If you pull up the stock market, you just pull up the S&P 500, after we're done here, pull up the S&P 500 and plot prices, or I should say stock volume on the horizontal axis, and then plot stock prices on the vertical axis. And what you will see is that there is what we call a huddle
Mm-hmm.
forming. Across the top of the huddle, you're going to see, you could actually draw a line across the top of the huddle. And you're going to see companies like Facebook and Microsoft. Amazon's actually beyond that. There's an outlier, but there's going to be several companies that form the top of this huddle. There's some companies that form the outer boundary, and then there's a lower boundary and an inner boundary. What's happened here is the market is self-aggregated relative to its limit. So that looks a lot like this.
Mm-hmm. It's
This
the
is a
room.
drawing.
It's the room.
Well,
You're
see
stuck
a
in the
drawing.
room. Like it, yeah.
Yeah, this is the Dow 30 Industrials on June 20th, 2019. So what I have here on the demand side is I've got some stocks that form this black demand frontier. So back then it included Boeing, Microsoft, Apple, and Pfizer. And you see there's an upper boundary that's formed here.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Well,
over,
what's fascinating is so like while you're thinking about that is like
yeah.
when I started getting fascinated by money, it was after we sold our business, and then I literally didn't even understand compound interest 10 years
Mm-hmm.
ago, and then I started learning about all this stuff, and then I was like, the trickle down demand side or supply side economics, and I'm like, wait a second, so like at the end of the day, people have to wake up, earn enough money to buy enough shit to keep us all in business.
Yes,
Right?
exactly.
Isn't that the demand
Yeah.
frontier? Is like if they don't
Yes.
have any money, like none of it works. And like all
Right.
you and I are doing with money is exchanging trust. So like which is according to the income statement and balance sheet. We're just having these IOUs back and forth. And so like one of us has to have money to trade something with each other. So the demand frontier is just like to your point of like this the aggregation, because you can't have it like you need the more people, the bigger the room gets, right? Because
Exactly.
they have
Yes.
more
Mm-hmm.
money.
Yep.
And so like, I just don't know how we can avoid these laws of nature, which I think a lot of economies and central governments have tried to ignore. And so I'm sitting here
Yes.
going like, I don't know how you get around this.
Well, that's kind of the whole point, Ryan. I mean, you're really grabbing what's going on here, frankly, much faster than I did when I came up with this idea. I'm a little embarrassed, but um, the central point about
I've been
something
thinking
like
about this
that.
like nonstop for like a decade, Doug, for whatever it's worth.
Well, the point about that is that these behaviors are mappable and predictable, and you can map and find exactly what's going on at any point in time. So you don't have to guess. So Clayton Christensen, the professor at Harvard, once stated that he believes, I think through some data, that 95% of all new product ideas fail. So what our big hope is here, I mean, globally, as I put out the book and form our company, but globally, what I hope happens is that people start to adopt this for themselves. And so what would happen if the failure rate went from 95% to 94%? Well, that's not too big, is it? Well, you flip that around and you say, well, what he's also saying is that 5% of new products succeed. Well, what if we went from 5% to 6%? Well, 1% of 5% is 20%. That's a 20% improvement. And so what our hope is that
Go ahead.
Our hope is that people will start to adopt this and start to have more frequent successes in markets, so that the money that's lost in endeavors like the DeLorean, the Eclipse 500, the Ariane jet, that stuff doesn't happen as frequently. That's kind of our big hope, is that doesn't happen nearly as often as it might.
Well, right on. Because also, like, the ramifications of that is just not like, oh, we don't have more jets, which I mean, I get the analogy, but or not the analogy, but the use case, but it's also like, yes, we can have better products and services. We can actually more effectively use the asset class of venture capital. Like, it has just been, I don't know. I just have like an issue with like, I'm sorry. I don't know how you can scale some of the stuff that people have been trying to scale. It's like, it doesn't make any sense to me. And they're getting the money from pension funds for teachers that need the $2,500 a month.
Oh,
right.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
like,
right.
And so it's like, it's the ripple effect of the inefficiency of this crap is actually a big deal when you have pension funds and all this money that's been thrown at ideas that are probably mappable to be failed right off the bat. if you thought
exactly.
about it this way.
Now, very interestingly, too, it's, I mean, some of you listeners might say, well, what about governments? Well, governments must be different. And it turns out that's exactly incorrect. Governments have demand limits, too. And governments have response services. So, for example, there's a principle that an economist back in the Ronald Reagan era, still alive, a guy named Arthur Laffer, came up with what's known as the Laffer curve. And the Laffer curve basically says that if you tax people at 0%, you get zero revenue. If you tax people 100%, you get zero revenue. And somewhere in between, there's a peak. Well, in 2014, the state of Colorado and the state of Washington both decided to legalize recreational marijuana. And they're going to they want to get taxes on it. They make it legal so they don't have to bust people for it. And then the other benefit would be that you're going to get taxes on it. So at the end of the year, Colorado, with fewer people than Washington State, Colorado had $375 million in recreational marijuana tax revenue. And Washington had 50.
Whoa, I never knew that.
So they had 7 times the revenue, even though they were a smaller state. Now, why did that happen? Well, Colorado was taxing at about 28 or 30%. And Washington State, I'm not making this up, was taxing at 108%. Now, who told them that was a good idea? I didn't. They eventually dropped it, and their revenues, surprise, surprise, shot up. I mean, and of course, the government being the government, nobody they named ever got fired for that. But the point is, you could have figured this out prior to that by figuring out what the tax rate is, what happens when you start to adjust taxes to a rate that's so high people can't stand it. So I'm just outside of the city of Los Angeles, California, and Los Angeles decided to enact what they call a mansion tax. And so if you had a house that's worth $5 million now, after the certain cutoff, I forgot when it is, I think it's February next year. But if you had a house that's worth $5 million or more, not only do you get to pay the regular property tax as you leave, you get to pay this additional penalty tax. Now, what do you suppose happens in a situation like that? Well, you get people like Mark Wahlberg, an LA resident. He's got a nice piece of property. He's got his own little 3-hole golf course on the property. People love Mark Wahlberg. Mark Wahlberg loved LA, but he didn't love it enough to stay here when you're going to tax him through the nose. So he lit out, just like a whole bunch of people lit out. Now, the state, to its detriment, could have done this demand analysis. Mm-hmm. They could have done this frontier analysis for tax revenues. And what they would find is that if the demand curve has a certain shape to it, you will actually get fewer dollars if you raise the rates than if you were to drop the rate. And so some people might have
you're taking it from that two-dimensional view to saying, like, where in the space, like, you can start to see. I mean, like, you see what the ramifications would be.
Exactly.
Doug,
exactly.
How did you get so passionate about this? Like, so I mean, because this is a topic where when you're going after like conventional thinking, like, what's been the response, and why have you stuck with this for so long?
Well, my first initial foray into this, besides trying to prove the law of supply and demand, was I said, well, why do projects keep failing?
And besides trying to buy the right washer for your wife.
Yeah, besides trying to buy the right washer, why do things fail?
Okay.
And then I said, well, maybe I could start to plot things. And then I started plotting, a lot of two-dimensional stuff. And I started plotting a bunch of three-dimensional stuff. And what I didn't realize until I came through with this breakthrough is that you can actually plot everything in, and this is key. I mean, if you take, Rene Descartes came up with the Cartesian coordinate systems that you're taught in high school, where you've got, a 2D plotting system, and you've got 4 sectors and 3 of them are negative. And they came up with the 3D plotting system, where you've got these octants, or I guess is what you call it, or quadrants. There's not quadrants, you have 8 of them. There's 8 regions, and 7 of them entertain negative numbers. And the breakthrough mentally was that, well, in business, there's no absolute negative number. If you have more cost than you've got revenue, you're comparing one non-negative number to another non-negative number. And so the insight was to jam everything together and have everything positive going from 0. Mm. And so what drove me to that was, why do things fail? I mean, why does the economy have to be sputtering when it could be booming, at all times? Why do people overvalue stocks? We get these big run-ups in the stock market, and we get these crashes. Why did the 2008 stock market crash happen? Well, I mean, it was all around housing. Well, why did that happen? Well, if you read The Big Short, see the movie, I did both, you'll find that they started to package these mortgages together.
Shit wrapped in shit, sold to people.
Yes, exactly. And well, now you have 2 or 3 problems there. One is that people who were being granted loans should never have had them. And 2, they weren't being fully, told everything that was going to happen there. And then 3, they were packaging these, back to your point, they're packaging these crappy products together and rating them more highly than they should have been. Well, had a fair broker come in and rated them properly, and the loans that were made that shouldn't have been made, this run-up, artificial run-up, wouldn't have happened. And so one of the things I think will happen going forward is that the stock market run-ups and collapses.
The 10-year cycles that you're talking about?
Yeah, the 10-year cycles. I think they're going to do 2 things. One is the amplitudes are going to dampen over time. I predict 10 to 20 to 30 years out, the amplitude will go down by half, a third to half, and the frequency will go down.
This is probably above and beyond for the listeners here, but I'm big into macroeconomics and the monetary policy, and like fiat currency and the quantitative easing and printing of money kind of changes the paradigm shift. Yeah. Okay. We'll leave that for a different conversation, but like,
that was, I know a little bit about that. I just griped, for those of you who haven't followed it much as Ryan has, when we hit this 2020 COVID incident, the Fed kind of silently, and they actually took it off their website. So if you look at the St. Louis Fed, which is known as, for whatever reason, as the Fred, well, they're controllers of what's known as the M1 money supply. And what they did is that M1 money supply had been coasting along, growing by a few percentage points every year until the beginning of 2020. And then in 2 quarters, Ryan, you can tell them probably what happened. Do you remember what happened?
It was like, what is it, $5 trillion over the last
Yeah,
Mm.
it went up by 400% in 2 quarters.
I know. It's well, and it just changes that changes the dynamic. So
Oh yeah.
we can park that over there because like that's like that like I love this stuff so much. But as far like I want to go back to when you're talking about the
Yeah.
business cycle. So if we were to
Sure.
assume that we were in the paradigm that logic resides in, which
Sure.
again, well, that's maybe tough
That's a bit of
sometimes.
reach sometimes, but yeah, suppose
I
that.
know, and more so every single day, Doug. And but like what I think is fascinating
Yeah.
is pulling the thread on like these business cycles. It's these booms and busts because you have credit availability and money available, and then
Right.
people get extended. And then I think part of the problem is they get overconfident and they're not making good bets, is really what ends up
Yes, that's a good
happening.
point.
So, and if cash flow is the name of the game for oxygen to keep things going, what I'm hearing is that there's a higher probability of having that prediction of where the ball is going to go while cash flowing and not just guessing, therefore
Yes, right.
decreasing the failure rate and increasing the success rate, increasing the cash flow, and
Right.
making that booms and busts less volatile, maybe less dramatic. And I think it'd be fascinating as we get into like the world of AI, of how AI can help us make some of these predictions and when some of these multidimensional decisions.
The other thing when we talk about the ball analogy, what's kind of cool about that is that you're seeing the existing momentum. So from the distant past, the near past, to the present, you're supposing that momentum is going to carry forward. It'll probably carry forward pretty reasonably well for a short period of time. But to use the physical analogy again, well, what happens if there's a gust of wind
Or a puddle.
or a puddle or another player? What happens? What happens then? And so I haven't studied that in near the depth that I hope to, and I hope some people will take up the mantle of this and start to run with it to model that, so that we have fewer massive failures of the economy as we've had in the past. Because most of these failures were preventable. I mean, 9/11, that's going to be you can't stop a 9/11 from affecting the financial markets, or World War II or World War I. But you can prevent somebody from overreacting the next time there's a COVID outbreak or something like that. Don't take the money supply up by 400%. Maybe take it up by 50%. Don't leave people on what amounts to extended unemployment for 2 and 3 years, when you could basically get them back into the workforce after a year and a half. Cut that outflow down and get people working more quickly. And there just wasn't any thought given to that. It just, we have a problem. We want to fix it. Let's fix it. And so
it's data.
It's the wrong answer.
For the listeners tuning in, I know I want to give them a place where they can find the book, your website, and all that stuff. But before that, Doug, like if you're running a private held business and you're trying to think about value creation, and also they're trying to predict where the ball is going. They've got their ball is the company, and like what are some ways that are actionable that people can think about things differently or start to apply some of these thoughts while they're running a company?
In private health, you said?
Privately held companies. So like,
privately held companies.
Yeah, like, business owners, CEOs that are listening and going, okay, I'm trying to create value and I'm grasping some of these concepts, but how should they start thinking or acting differently based on what we're talking about?
Well, they should think of it this way, is that, if you're standing as I am here in just a little bit inland in California, and you want to get to a port, you could kind of keep walking towards the ocean. And when you see seagulls, you say, oh, I'm getting close to the ocean. I'm probably getting close to the ports. But, ports are certain little enclaves of dirt that are formed in the landscape. And just getting to the coastline isn't enough. You want to get to the port. Well, imagine if you had this thing called a map.
You're speaking my language.
Some of you have heard of these things called maps.
I actually just interviewed the founder of MapQuest.
Yeah, right. When you take all this stuff down. I mean, I explain in the book, if you wanted to take the book down to 2 words, those 2 words are dot plots. Where you're sitting right now, I could plot it as a dot on a map. Same thing with me. And basically, where all these products are sitting out in a market can also be plotted the same way. And people aggregate these dots, these purchases for products, in ways in which you can characterize it and then use it to your own benefit. So rather than going storming off and building a supersonic business jet that'll fail, or a microjet that'll fail, or a new sports car that'll fail, why don't you go out and, these are those two aircraft stories I told you, those are $1 billion plus losses.
Right.
Excuse me, DeLorean lost at least 100 million, maybe $250 million in his venture. This only takes, I mean, once you get into it, it's not, I wouldn't say it's trivial. I mean, there's some learning involved here, but for several tens of thousands to low hundreds of thousands, you can actually understand your market in a way in which your competitors don't. And if you're selling something that's got any kind of quantities or any kind of price points to it that merit that, you should go off and do that. Now, having said that, this works for the corner restaurant too. During COVID, we went down to our corner restaurant, and they only could see people outside here in California. So it was, February, March, April in 2020, and it was cool outside, but we were sitting outside under some heaters on this small patio, and this place had a big inside seating area. And so all the people that used to come sit inside, well, now they're stringing out the door because they have the small patio area. And I told the manager of this place, I said, Kaylee, you want to make some more money? She says, well, of course I do. I said, well, here's what you need to do. Well, what they had was they had 3 tables of 6 in this little area and 3 tables of 4, and only had a couple tables of 2. And I had noticed from when I came in, and I eventually found this to be true nationwide, that the average party size in the United States is 1, and then the next most populous one is 2, and there are over twice as many parties of 2 as there are parties of 4. So I said, what you need to do, because you have a lot of parties of 1 or 2, is to get rid of the tables of 6, get rid of 2 of them, get rid of your, 1 or 2 of the tables of 4, and put in tables of 2. Well, they did that, and the revenue shot up 25% in 2 months.
Holy shit. I think also, Doug, like the people that are listening in that are looking to acquire a company.
Yeah.
Like what product and service and what marketplace. I mean, if you're going to go make a big acquisition, a big purchase, making sure that they do this kind of analysis so that it's the right product, pricing, value fit.
Oh, yeah. Same thing. It's easier to do it actually for an existing company. If you're picking an automotive company, you wanted to, for example, absorb, say you're a big company, you wanted to absorb Volkswagen, for example, you could actually go out and do all the analytics of all the auto companies and figure out what Volkswagen is worth based on, all the financial attributes that company has, and all the other ones that have
stuff. Yeah.
And all that data that now in that arena, that data is easily retrievable from, existing 401ks and things like that.
Well, and I should think about like Doug,
whatever their statements are.
Yeah. Well, I just think about how much work people go through in due diligence when they're going to buy a company, and like, yeah, this is probably worth exploring. So where can people find you, your book, the material?
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks. Appreciate that. I have my own personal website. It's Doug Howarth. That's DougHowarth.com. I also am heading up my own company, Hypernomics. So you can find us at hypernomics.com, hypernomics.com. And my book is entitled Hypernomics: Using Hidden Dimensions to Solve Unseen Problems. It's coming out through Wiley on the 29th of January.
Nice.
You can find it on Wiley's site, or you can also find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. So if you just type in Doug Howarth or Hypernomics at either of those sites, the book will come up. And it's available for pre-sale now.
Awesome. And I believe by the time this goes out, it'll be right around that time. So thank you so much for coming on the show. This was an absolute blast.
Well, I had a lot of fun too, Ryan. And you've got some really, really nice guests on your show, and I feel honored and privileged to be part of it. So thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun with it today. Thank you.